Hey guys, Connor, you're watching the JavaScript Mastery series, and in this video we are going to learn about two of JavaScript's special types, null and undefined. We will talk about what they are and also why they are special. Then we will compare them and what makes them similar, and then we will look at the difference between them and which one you should use and when. So let's get started. So what is null? Null is a special keyword that is used to indicate that a value is intentionally absent. So keyword there is intentionally. It signifies that there is no value here assigned. However, it is intentional and somewhat expected. So this could indicate some kind of missing data. Maybe a user has submitted a form, you asked for a middle name, made it optional, and it's expected that that middle name might be missing, but the field exists there anyway. We're going to look at the data, but that data is going to be null, or it could be the second line of an address. Again, the field is optional and it's expected that it could be null 50% of the time. Now, the interesting thing about null is that when we use the type of operator on it, it actually returns an object. It's kind of weird because null is technically a type, but JavaScript, when we use that type of operator, it comes back as being an object, which is somewhat unexpected, right? But this is actually a known bug in JavaScript where null is mistakenly classified as an object. However, null is not an object. It is its own unique type in JavaScript that represents the absence of a value. What is undefined? Similar to null, undefined represents some missing data. You know, something isn't there. However, with undefined, it's usually unintentional. We expected to have that data, but we don't have it. And a lot of the times it indicates that something has gone wrong. This can happen when we might try to access a variable that isn't there. A lot of the times this can happen when you're trying to access the property of an object and that property doesn't exist, or maybe you're trying to access the element of an array and it doesn't exist there either. So you just get undefined. It can also happen in a scenario where you've used a function, but that function doesn't return any data, and by default, when nothing's returned, a function is going to be value of that function is going to be undefined. Now, unlike null, when we use the type of operator on undefined, it actually returns undefined. Now, even though both null and undefined represent the absence of a value, they have distinct behaviors that make them slightly different from one another and have slightly different use cases as to when you should use each one. Now, null is often deliberate. There's some data missing, however, it was expected that data could be missing, right? It's nothing to be concerned about and no reason for us to be worried. Again, going back to that earlier example, maybe we asked for a second address line, but it's optional, or some kind of middle name and it's optional. And when that data wasn't passed in, it just deferred to null. Again, when we see null, no cause of concern, nothing to worry about, it's expected. Now, with undefined, it usually means something is missing, however, it's unexpected. We wasn't expecting this and it's a cause of concern. So a lot of the time when we come across that undefined, we want to handle it within our code base to raise it and make sure that within our code base we're aware that this data is missing, and we want to treat it with more urgency than we would with null. Both null and undefined are useful, and knowing how to use which one and in which scenario and how to deal with each one when you come across them is going to help your code be more precise and help prevent unintended bugs. Hero, and let's say it's undefined. The value is undefined. That value now of hero is undefined. Now, when I look at the type of it, undefined, its value is undefined, and the type of undefined is undefined. It's this value that has its completely own type, and that's what makes it kind of special in JavaScript. Now, when it comes to null, yes, the value is undefined, but of course its type is object. So it's not technically correct to say it's special like undefined is, because it doesn't have its undefined, it's object. But it's not a typical object, and it shouldn't really be an object. It's only an object because of a bug in JavaScript. I mean, objects can have properties and methods, right? But with villain, if we try to use any property, or there's no properties or methods available to it, that's because you can't use properties and methods on the null. In fact, if you try to access a property on null, you will, so let's say you're trying to access a property for some reason, you want to get villain age. Now you could do that on an object, right? But you can't do that. You can't read the properties of null. Null does not have properties. It's not an objecty object. It should be its own type. So that is why I said undefined and null are kind of special values in JavaScript, because they have their own types within their own right, even though null technically doesn't. Okay, so to recap, we learned what is null, what is undefined, discussed how they both represent the absence of data. We then discussed what makes them special. Both of these values have their own types in their own right, even though null kind of technically doesn't. Then we discussed how to use each one, and how null is expected data missing, and undefined tends to be unintended data missing that was expected. And guys, hope you got some value out of this video, and see you in the next one.